So I just want to talk about the way that we prime ourselves or expectation when we're going into sort of really long duration difficulty or challenge, and there's a lot of uncertainty or unknown. So I've sort of used a number of techniques going into sort of long-term operational deployments, because obviously there's a lot of uncertainty there, a lot of unknowns, and I use the same sort of techniques and the same understanding going into sort of some of the extreme adventure races I use. So when we sort of look at it, we prime the way that we expect things to go, and that has an impact on the way that we both perform within that environment and the outcomes that we get. So sort of to help you understand, I'll kind of explain it in sort of a simplified understanding without going into excessive detail, but to give you an indication. So when we have an expectation or the way that we think about what's going to happen, it kind of primes us or motivates us from top down. So we've got a top down system and a bottom up. So we've got top down, bottom up. So the top-down system is kind of motivated by the information, stimulus, or the cues that we need to conduct the task. So this information is task relevant, and then the bottom up is around about threat cues. So down here, this is threat. So when we're in a normal day-to-day function, we sort of go between task and threat, and we sort of go through our environment looking for the information that we need to conduct our task based on the motivation or our expectation. And then we look at the obstacles, the threats, or the challenges that we have. And there's a kind of a normal interplay between these two. So we see the threats to our task, and then we go through and we look for the information we need to overcome it. If we come into a difficult situation and we think in terms of we're going to have negative outcomes or it's going to be overly difficult for us, then we prime this information with a filter. So that filters what we're looking for. So if our expectation is that we can't do it, then we're motivated or we look for information that says we can't do it, like a self-fulfilling prophecy type of thing. And so that's what we start to look for. So that changes the way that sensory information, the way that we sort of read or we pick up messaging from what people say, what we read, the way that we look at people, and the way that we pick up on their sort of non-verbal communication. It's all based around this filter. So if we've primed ourselves for negative outcomes, then that's the way that we filter environment. Whereas if we've primed ourselves for this could be difficult, but I'm going to get over it, I'm going to grow, and there could be positives to this, then we look for the information to conduct the task. So there's been numerous occasions where I've sort of gone into ambushes or gunfights, and I've gone in and I could think, you know, I'm going to get shot, I could get killed, and it's very easy to get into that, but I start to think about, all right, I need the information to conduct the task. So I become very task relevant, and then I look for the threats that are going to get in my way. Obviously someone with a gun is going to be the threat. So if we go in thinking that we can do it, we're going to stay on task. And for something like this, there's information that we need to both treat the patients that we have and to get through it. So we want to maintain our motivation and our expectation around getting through it, and then there's a number of other things that we can use to deal with it. So when we do pick up on threats within our environment, or we become over anxious, or we sort of change our nutrition, or our sleep gets deprived, or we become overly fatigued, then we start to become a little bit more threat orientated. So we shift down here and we start to operate sort of looking mostly at threats, and we want to, or we can get into avoidance. So again, as I sort of said, that changes the way that we filter information. So we have information coming in here in the form of sort of cues or stimulus or patterns, or whatever, however you want to call it, within the environment. So we start to look for less of the task related information and more for threat related information, because we're going to avoid it because we're low on energy and we don't perceive we have the energy to overcome difficulty or overcome the challenge. So we want to make sure that we're looking after ourselves so that we don't start heading down towards threat. And then when we look at it throughout our day, we kind of start off sort of task and threat, and then it goes throughout the period of our day. We start off so that we're orientated, or we're sort of refreshed, so we're looking for task relevant information. We're happy to take on stuff throughout our day, and as the day goes along, we start to decrease our ability as we get fatigued. And the more threat we have, the more that can drop off. Okay, if we have periods of recovery, we can pick that up. Okay, so it sort of depends on how we go throughout our day, and this sort of fluctuates as we go. So if we go from one high threat or one high emotion encounter into another, then we can deplete this really quickly, and we can operate from this threat orientated sort of situation or this scenario. So some of the things that can help us work through this is kind of breathing. So there's been a lot of work around breathing, and breathing helps because as we sort of going through this, and if we think about it in terms of regulating our central nervous system, or that sort of fight, flight, freeze response, is that if we can regulate our central nervous system and we can calm down, we can start to move from this area back up into task relevant, and we can start to see information that we need to conduct the task rather than looking for threats or trying to see threats early so we can avoid it. So breathing's one thing that we can go on with, and it just has to be simple sort of breathing in kind of a same cycle in, same cycle out. So 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out, 6 seconds in, 6 seconds out, okay, just something similar to that. Even things like a deep breath in and a sigh has shown to be effective. It doesn't need to be overly complicated. The other one is sort of taking visual breaks, so sort of getting outside if you can, and I know that these environments aren't always conducive to it, but if you get away from that very clustered, very sort of claustrophobic environment, because our visual system does look at threat response as well, so anything that's close proximity increases our threat response, anything that's at a distance decreases or lets our vigilance come down because we've got more perceived time to respond to any threats. So if you can get outside for just a short break, then that's going to calm you down as well. Nature seems to calm down or calm us down as well, or allow us to reduce that level of anxiety. Things like posture, if we have a relaxed posture or we just sort of take time here and there to become aware of our posture, that can calm us down a little bit. But the other big one that's really important to us is interpersonal interactions. So the big thing that we want to make sure that when we're in times of crisis or under a lot of stress is that we're getting enough or an appropriate interpersonal interactions, because the last thing that we want when we're under pressure is to feel like we're alone or we're isolated. We want to make sure that we're surrounded, because numbers provides us safety. We want to feel safe at the end of the day. So that's the big thing that we're looking at. So if we're having a day where we're going down like this, just someone giving us a hug or a smile can start to bring us up. Okay, and a lot of this is perceptual as well. It's not actually regulated by how much energy we have or energy we don't have, or the threats that we've seen or threats that we haven't seen. A lot of it is perceived. Okay, so simple things can change perception, okay, changes how we feel, okay, brings us back up to be more task relevant or task related. So making sure that we're working with each other. Big thing as well there is our hierarchy plays a big role, has a big influence. So if we're working for leaders who care, who show us a little bit of sort of love and affection, sort of show that we're important, then that's going to increase this as well. So they have a really big role on the culture within the team and the way it functions. So that interpersonal interaction is a really big thing. Taking breaks for yourself, making sure you're looking after yourself outside of your shift. So even small sort of short walks of a morning, because exercise can help. And if we're under a lot of pressure, we want to keep it low intensity. So walking, if you get out early in the morning, walk with early morning sunlight, you're getting good sort of long distance visual stimulation or visual sort of sensory perception, so that reduces the vigilance down there. You're getting a bit of nature, you're getting low aerobic, and it's going to start to reset us a little bit, making sure that we're sleeping. Okay, we're going to sort of remove a lot of the clutter from our lives around our home. Okay, there's a lot of stresses that we have, sort of relationships around home, around life, around social, around virtual, these sort of things. So making sure that you're reducing a lot of those extra stresses, because you sort of don't want to fill up your bucket too much, because if we think it in terms of how much stress we've got, and people like the cup or the bucket analogy. So if that's our bucket and we start off the morning and we've only got a little bit of water in there because we've sort of depleted it overnight, or we've allowed it to replenish overnight through good sleep, okay, as we have these interactions throughout the day, everyone sort of drops a little bit of water in our bucket, okay, and the more that bucket gets full, the more we come down to be looking at threats, because once we've only got a little bit of energy left here, we want to preserve it by avoiding threat. So each time we have an interaction with someone else, they take some water out of our bucket, and if we get good sleep, then it replenishes or it reduces the amount of water in our bucket, because overnight we sort of get both the physical recovery, but we get the cognitive recovery, and really importantly we get the emotional reconciliation from throughout the day. So that's sort of a real brief overview of kind of anticipation or expectation, and a little bit around threat response and how we can prime that to get our best outcomes, because ultimately we are capable of getting through really long, really difficult, long duration threat, but the way we frame that or the way we anticipate the outcomes has a really big impact. So if we go in positive, thinking that, yeah, it's going to be difficult, we can get through it, and there's benefit on the other side, then our outcomes are going to be a lot better. So if you've got any questions, if there's any answers that you specifically want to any specific questions, then please reach out, and I'll do as much as I can to get out information that's going to help.